Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, the gentleman from California, Chairman Royce, is permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Chairman Royce is a member of the Financial Services Committee, and we appreciate his interest in this important topic as chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I appreciate everyone's indulgence as we are delayed in the start of this hearing, just coming from votes, but this hearing couldn't be more timely and more important, so we appreciate your participation. This hearing is entitled Restricting North Korea's Access to Finance. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. The focus of today's hearing, restricting North Korea's access to finance, will appear timely to many observers. With the July 4th test launch of the country's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-14, it would now seem time to cut off the North's resources and deprive it of the means to further develop its nuclear and missile technologies. But in fact, the time to think about genuine limitations on North Korea's capabilities is long overdue, as more than 2 decades of failed agreements, punctuated by 5 nuclear tests since 2006, have made clear. As a result, hovering over this hearing is not only a sense of urgency, but disappointment in years of misguided assumptions about the North's behavior and vulnerability to pressure. If we are to change North Korea's calculations, we must confront why economic sanctions have failed and adapt our policies accordingly. More of the same is unacceptable. Of course, sanctions can respond to any number of North Korean outrages. One thinks immediately of Otto Warmbier, an American student who was imprisoned for more than a year in Pyongyang, only to pass away last month, just days after being sent home in a coma. Other crimes come to mind as well, from cybersecurity attacks around the world, including the alleged heist of $81 million from Bangladesh's central bank last year, or the continued abuse of political prisoners and their families in DPRK's labor camps. Today, however, we will be concentrating on the Kim regime's proliferation efforts, with the aim of making our sanctions policy both more realistic and more ambitious as well. More realistic by evaluating the actual trade and finance networks exploited by Pyongyang, and more ambitious by assessing new sanctions targets that can influence North Korean behavior, even if those entities are located outside the DPRK itself. We must also calibrate our sanctions according to how enforceable they are. The future of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, whether in North Korea or elsewhere, hinges on getting their implementation right. Central to North Korea's behavior is China, the DPRK's largest trading partner. It is often said that Beijing is worried more about stability in its region than a nuclear-armed North Korea. However, a nuclear North Korea with a flourishing missile program is incompatible with regional stability, as it would allow Pyongyang to bully its neighbors and manufacture new crises on demand. While much ink has been spilled over China's role as an emerging global leader, we should be clear that North Korea is a test of that claim. Pyongyang's behavior underlines that Beijing still has a long way to go to pass this test convincingly. In the end, our goal should be nothing less than stopping North Korea from being able to threaten the U.S. with a nuclear device. This may mean stripping Pyongyang of the wherewithal to further develop its weapons. It may mean sowing dissent among North Korea's elite. It may mean convincing China that the long-term costs of sanctions require it to lean on the Kim regime. Different observers will attach different probabilities to each of these outcomes. But again, the overarching goal, the protection of the U.S. and U.S. lives on U.S. territory, must be ever present, with sanctions designed and ultimately judged with this goal foremost in mind. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Gwen Moore, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for joining us this afternoon. I know that more and more Americans are concerned, especially when they hear that North Korea has just launched a missile that the Pentagon believes could potentially reach our nation. North Korea is a belligerent nation with nuclear aspirations and an unstable leader. President Obama warned President Trump that North Korea would be the most urgent national security threat facing our country. I sure wish we had had this hearing before the House took up and passed major new North Korea sanctions legislation, H.R. 1644, Korean Interdiction and Modernization Sanctions Act. All options may be on the table with North Korea, but that doesn't mean that all of them are wise, effective, or even practical. The absolute best tool the U.S. has against North Korea is our global leadership and credibility to lead diplomacy and sanctions efforts. And yet, U.S. ambassadorships to Japan and South Korea remain vacant, and the President has yet to nominate a permanent Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. Needless to say, in a tense and volatile region, unpredictable or absent policy or actions runs the risk of unimaginable consequences for our country and our allies. Sanctions, as the chair have a limit. They have a role to play, but so does robust diplomacy. North Korea is well-versed at sanctions evasion, so we need effective, globally enforced measures. These efforts take years of hard work and cannot be turned off or on in an instant. We need the continuity, serious diplomatic work rather than unpredictability or saber-rattling is the right way to press North Korea. It's just ridiculous to think that we can engage on North Korea absent enduring, persistent, and tireless effort and the proper resourcing of the State Department, another area where our president is lacking in responding to the situation. I want to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Sherman. California. Oh, God, I'll never be forgiven.
I thank the gentleman. I'm so thrilled the gentlelady would yield. I'll be from whatever state she suggests. Served for 20 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I now am the ranking member on the Asia Subcommittee. I'm glad we're having these hearings about closing off on North Korea's access to the financial system, but unless we pressure China, we will only be able to annoy or punish the North Koreans, but not force them to change their behavior. The idea has been put forward for 20 years that if we just have someone brilliant and eloquent go to Beijing, they'll realize that their policy toward North Korea is wrong and they'll adopt our policy. That will not happen. As long as China can have a strong North Korea on the one hand and have easy access to American markets on the other hand, they will continue their present policy. So we are not in a position where more rhetoric or eloquence will solve the problem. We have to change the facts. We have to choose between two approaches. One is putting pressure on China by saying access to U.S. markets will not be available to them as long as they support the North Korean regime in its present configuration and policies. Or second, we need to build fallout shelters starting on the West Coast. Because the idea of just saying we're going to close this or that banking relationship, therefore we've done something, is a way to ignore to fail to build those fallout shelters, which are more necessary now than they were 20 years ago. Now, we also have to have reasonable goals. China will not allow the overthrow of this regime. The regime will cling to power and cling to at least some nuclear weapons. If we have a reasonable policy, a big stick toward China, and a willingness to accept a very limited, highly monitored, non-missiles cache of nuclear weapons, we may be successful. But if we think that just restricting North Korea without China changing its policy will work, it won't. It may cause North Korea to free this or that prisoner of conscience, but it won't cause them to give up their missile and nuclear program. And if we think China is going to put pressure on North Korea that endangers the regime when they can have access to our markets anyway, that's not going to happen.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Sherman and I did raise this issue with the Premier in Beijing. He's right. We've got to leverage this with China. We have only one example where this has been effective, and that was with North Korea with Banco Delta Asia, when we froze the accounts in a dozen of those banks. And at that point in time, they could not get the hard currency to continue with their program. Recently, I had passed legislation with Mr. Engel that was signed into law. The Security Council has taken up, the UN Security Council has put that into force. That was H.R. 757. Mr. Sherman also raised the point that there are some loopholes that the North Koreans have developed. One of those loopholes is the use of forced labor overseas, where the check actually goes to the regime rather than the money going to the workers. And we have a long list of countries that are only too willing to feed these workers without paying them. And that loophole we closed by the bill that we passed 419 to 1, another bill that I passed into the Senate. We're having trouble getting that bill out of the Senate. It also closes a loophole used by some of the Chinese financial institutions. And so I'm hoping this hearing today, and I think the chairman will put enough pressure on the Senate for them to move that legislation. And then, yes, enforcement is key to this. Leverage on Beijing is key to this. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired, and today we welcome the testimony of Anthony Ruggiero, a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and has spent more than 17 years in the U.S. government as an expert in the use of targeted financial measures. Most recently, he was a foreign policy fellow in the office of Senator Marco Rubio and was Senator Rubio's senior advisor on issues related to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Ruggiero has also served in the Treasury Department as Deputy Director and then Director of the Office of Global Affairs and the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. In this capacity, he developed and implemented policy options to combat illicit finance, including terrorist financing and proliferation finance, kidnapping for ransom, money laundering, narco-trafficking, and transnational organized crime. Prior to joining Treasury, Mr. Ruggiero spent over 13 years in various capacities at the State Department, including as Chief of the Defensive Measures and WMD Finance Team. William Newcomb is a visiting scholar with the U.S. Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. From 2011 to 2014, he served as a member of the United Nations Security Council panel of experts on North Korea, and from 2002 to 2005, he was Deputy Coordinator of the U.S. State Department's North Korea Working Group. Mr. Newcomb has served in senior economist positions, both at state and U.S. Treasury. While at Treasury, he conducted investigations into Banco Delta Asia, which in 2005 was designated an institution of primary money laundering concern for its role in illicit North Korean financial activities. Elizabeth Rosenberg is a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Under the Obama administration, she served as a senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Treasury to Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Dr. John Park is director of the Korea Working Group and is an adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also a faculty affiliate with the Project on Managing the Atom at the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. From 2012 to 2013, Dr. Park was a Stanton Nuclear Security Junior Faculty Fellow at MIT's Security Studies program. He previously directed Northeast Asia projects at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington and has served as the project leader of the North Korea Analysis Group at the Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Ruggiero, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today on this important issue. Kim Jong-un is a despot who murdered an American citizen, tortures, starves, and kills his own people, and will spare no expense to achieve an intercontinental ballistic missile that can deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States. Furthermore, one should not assume Kim will hold back from using his nuclear weapons on America and our allies. Sanctions remain the best policy option to protect the United States and its allies from North Korea's expanding programs. Both critics and supporters of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal agree that sanctions brought Iran to the negotiating table. The Trump administration should use the Iran sanctions playbook for its North Korea policy. It is common for scholars and journalists to note that years of strong sanctions against North Korea have failed. It is true that thus far sanctions have not achieved the U.S. objective of disarming North Korea, but it is not true that sanctions have been either strong or well enforced, or that they cannot work. An effective North Korea sanctions regime would target Pyongyang's international business and non-North Koreans facilitating sanctions evasion. On slide 1, a quantitative review of U.S. sanctions programs reveals that North Korea currently sits 5th behind Ukraine, Russia, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. North Korea sanctions have more than doubled since the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act came into effect on February 18, 2016. Prior to that date, North Korea ranked 8th behind Ukraine, Russia, Iran, Iraq, the Balkans, Syria, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. Slide 2, please. The UN panel of experts reported in February of this year that North Korea uses, quote, non-nationals of North Korea as facilitators and relies on numerous front companies, end quote. Slide 3, please. At present, only 2% of UN sanctions and 12% of U.S. sanctions target non-North Koreans facilitating Pyongyang sanctions evasion, while only 27% of UN sanctions and 47% of U.S. sanctions target North Korea's international business. Thus, while the number of U.S. and UN North Korea sanctions may be increasing, they focus on the wrong areas. The goal of sanctions on North Korea is different than it was with Iran, since the regime will not negotiate away its nuclear program. Kim Jong-un views negotiations merely as one step toward his goal of recognition of North Korea as a state with nuclear weapons. The U.S. goal should be to protect the U.S. and its allies at all costs by strangling the sources of revenue and its materiel on which North Korea relies for its nuclear weapons program. The key aspect of Iran's sanctions model that worked, it forced companies, individuals, banks, and governments wherever located to make a choice: continue doing business with Iran or join the U.S. efforts. The approach worked around the world as banks and companies and eventually governments curtailed or eliminated business with Iran. To be as tough on North Korea as it was on Iran, the U.S. should move aggressively against Chinese banks that are integral to North Korea's sanctions evasion efforts. Information on North Korea's use of Chinese banks to access the American banking system is incomplete. The available estimates generally encompass only transactions with designated North Korean entities and individuals or those who work on their behalf. One pattern that emerges is the disturbing extent to which Chinese banks help North Korea leverage the U.S. financial system to evade sanctions. Recent disclosures show that from 2009 to 2017, North Korea used Chinese banks to process at least $2.2 billion in transactions through the U.S. financial system. Pyongyang's provocations, including its test of an ICBM, deserve increasingly harsh responses from Washington. A new North Korea sanctions approach is needed to secure the United States and its allies against the dangerous and growing threat from this rogue regime. Iran-style sanctions are the only peaceful way to coerce the Kim regime, and for that reason are indispensable. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Newcomb, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. And I want to discuss the effectiveness of international sanctions. Now, as we meet, our representative to the UN is seeking agreement on yet another sanctions resolution as a response to the DPRK's test of an ICBM earlier this month. If one were adopted soon, it would be the second in as many months and the 8th overall, beginning with UNSCR 1718 back in 2006, upon which subsequent resolutions have been built. To date, All but one of the sanctions resolutions have been adopted under Chapter 7, Article 41 of the UN Charter. That's crucially important so that they are legally binding upon all member states. All the resolutions were announced with rhetorical flourishes about how the latest measures adopted were even more comprehensive and tougher. The trajectory of successive sanctions measures does show resolutions adopting a broadened set of targets and becoming more comprehensive, especially in restrictions on trade, transport, and finance. I would expect proposed measures now being discussed to continue in that direction. Despite delays in adoption while being negotiated, which gives the DPRK time to take immediate defensive measures and move assets of entities likely to be designated, and built-in loopholes insisted upon by China and Russia, these measures are of immense value, potentially. Regrettably, the success the U.S. and like-minded countries have achieved in getting tougher sanctions adopted has been blunted by inadequate action by most member states, squandering the political capital Washington has spent to obtain agreement from Beijing and Moscow. Over the past decade, the record of implementation is poor. There were some years when even members of the Security Council had not implemented the measures. Typically, it took several years following adoption for the rate of implementation to reach the 50% mark. This appears true for all UN sanctions program. It also held true for Iran, for example. More recently, efforts by the 1718 Committee and the panel of experts to address this problem through outreach appear to be having some success. As of July 10th, 92 of 192 member states have reported implementation of Resolution 2270, which was passed in 2016, and 70 had reported implementation of 2321, which passed later last year. These numbers include states reporting on implementation for the first time. Thus, prospects are improved for attaining a higher rate of adoption. But unfortunately, reports on implementation don't tell the whole story. Many nations fail to disclose details about how sanctions were implemented. Even those that do, upon inspection, have fallen short of what was required. Mexico, for example, didn't implement the assets freeze provision, which gave it a big headache when it tried to seize the Mudu Bong, which was a ship owned by Office of Maritime Management. Singapore prosecuted Chenpo Shipping for violation of proliferation finance. It was overturned by the High Court in Singapore because that part of the resolution hadn't been implemented correctly. If Mexico and Singapore, countries that have adequate resources and good regulatory capacity, have difficulty in implementing sanctions, think about the problem faced by many countries that don't have adequate capacity. Then we get to the problem of enforcement. When it comes to the UN, violations are not treated as a judicial matter, but as a political one. Following the 2013 nuclear test, 43 candidates were proposed for designation. China accepted only 3. One of the ones on that list of 43 that was not accepted was a company known as Pan Systems Pyongyang. It was revealed earlier this year as a front for Reconnaissance General Bureau, involved in the sale of battlefield technical radios via a Malaysian listed company named Glocom. Now, the U.S. and like-minded countries are uniquely able to leverage the effect of international sanctions by adopting positive and negative incentive to encourage states to implement and rigorously enforce them. You need to give assistance to capacity challenged states. You need to encourage one way or another those that lack political will. And states that tolerate or help in evading sanctions need to face consequences. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Rosenberg, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and distinguished members of this committee for the opportunity to testify today on restricting North Korea's access to financial services. There are an array of international sanctions and other restrictive financial measures on North Korea to expose and constrain its increasingly dangerous missile and nuclear proliferation activities. However, these measures have had limited utility in compelling North Korea to curb its proliferation activities. This is unsurprising, given the until recent narrow focus of sanctions only on proliferation materials and actors, significantly within North Korea, as well as the limited implementation of sanctions, including by China, which provides over 90% of North Korea's trade volume. U.S. policy leaders can and should use restrictive financial measures more aggressively as part of a holistic U.S. strategy to pressure North Korea. The country is not sanctioned out, and many loopholes can be closed with new measures and stronger enforcement, as has already been mentioned. An invigorated U.S. effort should involve sanctioning more of the agents that procure and proliferate missile and nuclear components and that raise and launder money for North Korea. Sanctions officials should target transit hubs for North Korea and the entities that do business through these hubs. They should also target additional economic sectors in North Korea, including mining, energy, light manufacturing, transportation, and construction. They can also consider sanctioning commercial tour operators in North Korea with appropriate exceptions. Additionally, though it will be politically sensitive and economically significant, U.S. officials should focus sanctions on front companies in China and elsewhere to stymie the shippers, insurers, manufacturers, and traders that wittingly and unwittingly prop up Pyongyang. Moreover, U.S. officials should restrict banks from financing the manufacture or facilitating the purchase of North Korean exports, including coal, minerals, textiles, and other products. Also, U.S. policy leaders should require that all payments to North Korean entities be held in escrow accounts outside North Korea, with limitations on how the money can be used. True success in altering Pyongyang's financial means and its proliferation aims will only be delivered if its key conduit to the international financial system, China, makes the strategic decision to impose constraints on North Korea. China will not easily be swayed to this end and will only do so to achieve its own interests. This means that the United States will have to find ways to cooperate with Beijing, and this will necessitate intensive diplomacy and creative thinking about how to advance mutual interests. It should also involve imposition of U.S. sanctions on North Korean front companies and facilitators in China to clarify strong U.S. resolve when it comes to North Korea and intolerance of sanctions evasions and non-enforcement in China. Tough new sanctions, carefully implemented with multilateral partners, are an important part of the financial strategy to address the North Korean threat. However, they must be grounded in a broad policy effort to protect the financial system and institutions generally against abuse by proliferators. This is notoriously difficult, even for the most sophisticated banks, as proliferation finance is often hidden behind money laundering schemes or what appears to resemble the financing of industrial goods trade or retail banking of all-cash businesses. The United States is well placed to lead a much-needed global initiative to combat proliferation finance, and administration officials should explore the creation of a new proliferation finance tracking program with key international allies to more easily share and analyze financial data across national boundaries. This will make it easier to map proliferation networks, gathering leads to target with sanctions, also with law enforcement tools, intelligence tools, and others. U.S. policymakers should also give further public guidance on typologies of proliferation finance to aid banks in stopping this activity and contemplate additional legal protections or risk management guidance to promote more financial information sharing between the government and banks and among banks. Sanctions and counterproliferation finance policy must be used more intensively, along with other national tools to achieve meaningful progress in deterring North Korea from its proliferation aims. I applaud this committee's attention to this important issue and thank you for the opportunity to discuss it with you today. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Dr. Park, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairman Barr, Ranking Member Moore, and members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you today. I'm particularly honored to be on the same panel with Mr. Bill Newcomb, who has mentored me and many others in researching the North Korean regime's illicit activities. As requested by the subcommittee, I'll be summarizing my research into the North Korean regime's accumulated learning in evading sanctions. The key takeaway is not that the North Korean regime has been evading sanctions. They've been engaged in this activity for decades. Rather, it's the story of how North Korea's sanctions evasion techniques have improved significantly because of North Korea Incorporated's migration to the Chinese marketplace. As a result, U.S. policymakers need to factor in these growing gaps and consider underutilized measures like Chinese domestic policy tools to disrupt Chinese-North Korean business partnerships and restrict North Korea's access to finance. My MIT colleague, Dr. Jim Walsh, and I recently conducted research on North Korea Incorporated, a term we use to describe the web of state trading companies, or STCs, that the regime operates. we found that STC managers were able to significantly improve their procurement operations by engaging in the following 4 main activities. Number 1, hiring more capable Chinese middlemen. Instead of impeding procurement activities, we found that additional sanctions in some key instances have actually attracted more capable Chinese middlemen, incentivized by bigger payday through elevated commission fees. The North Korean regime has financed these larger paydays by drawing on sizable slush funds on the mainland that had amassed during the lucrative North Korea-China coal trade in the late 2000s. Number 2, embedding in commercial hubs in China. What was striking about interviewing former STC managers was the normalcy of their business practices. Like American or European expatriate businessmen, they explained the challenges and opportunities of operating in a particular local market in Asia. By embedding in commercial hubs in China, STC managers gained tacit business knowledge that was critical to increasing their procurement effectiveness. Number 3, leveraging commercial and banking hubs in Hong Kong and Southeast Asia. As global trends in trading and banking shifted to this part of Asia, these managers have benefited from increased access to business partners with an international reach. In the case of Hong Kong, we documented how a former STC manager based there was able to procure high-tech medical equipment from Japan through a local business partner. This partner filled out all the required documentation using the details of its own registrations and licenses. In the case of Singapore, it has been a particularly useful venue for STC managers to pay local firms to arrange wire transfers for payments to foreign counterparties. As Singapore has rapidly risen to be a global center of money management, opportunities abound for the North Korean regime to benefit from illicit financial service offerings. Number 4, extensive use of embassies as a vehicle for procurement. North Korean embassies serve 2 key functions with respect to North Korea Incorporated's illicit activities. The first is serving as a vehicle for procuring controlled items in a foreign country. Former STC managers note that the regime co-locates shell companies with its embassies in countries that offer unique access to sought-after items ordered by the regime. The second function is the ability to credential an STC manager as a North Korean diplomat. In addition to gaining valuable tacit business knowledge by embedding in a country for a longer duration, STC managers are able to use diplomatic pouches for illicit purposes relating to transporting a banned item or carrying unreported cash. The net effect of sanctions was that they, in practice, ended up increasing the regime's procurement capabilities, what we call the sanctions conundrum. Because of the elevated risk of doing business, an SEC had to pay higher commission fees to private Chinese companies that played a middleman role. The elevation of risks and rewards attracted more capable professional middlemen into illicit activities on behalf of North Korean clients. In sum, targeted sanctions unintentionally and counterproductively, and counterintuitively, I should say, helped to more efficiently enable these North Korean incorporated actors to operate in the Chinese marketplace. With an improved understanding of how North Korea Incorporated evades sanctions, we can better disrupt its business partnerships in China. In this endeavor, we need to develop ways to bolster the impact of sanctions, but we also need to explore other policy tools. Diversifying the set of policy tools and coordinating with different policy actors will significantly constrain the remarkably open space within which North Korea Incorporated currently operates. A top priority is to disrupt these partnerships upstream, before the procured item becomes a part of globalized trade flows. In addition to the recommendations offered by my distinguished colleagues on the panel, I'd like to bring to the subcommittee's attention another policy option, what I call the 3 antis. These are a set of China's domestic policy tools, namely anti-corruption apparatus, anti-narcotics campaign, and anti-counterfeiting activities that can be used to impede North Korea's illicit procurement. I'll be glad to discuss them in greater detail during the Q&A. In conclusion, stopping North Korea Incorporated's illicit procurement and blocking its access to finance constitute a top priority in slowing down the regime's rapid advances in its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The work of the subcommittee, the panel members, as well as sanctions-focused officials is critical in finding new, adaptive, and effective ways to counter the North Korean regime's WMD threats to the United States, its Northeast Asian allies, and the international community. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Park, your writings have documented how illicit procurement by the North Koreans is embedded in these legal trade networks. The final report of the UN panel of experts has also found that the DPRK continues to access the international financial system. How can we better identify, and you've spoken about these brokers and middlemen in China, how can we better identify these middlemen and these transactions that violate our sanctions against North Korea?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one aspect of this is to view these as business transactions. One of the incredible store of knowledge about doing business in China reside in American Chamber of Commerce members and others who have experience in these marketplaces. I think using that lens gives us another angle to observe these type of partnerships and activities that frankly are bewildering in terms of their normalcy. So I think from that angle is to adopt the business lens that goes away from the security aspects, but in understanding the causality within the business community, bring those insights to enhancing these type of policy tools.
And is there anything else besides that recommendation that we can do to adopt kind of a holistic approach that would deter Chinese middlemen from working with the North Koreans so that we don't have this kind of whack-a-mole scenario where the North Koreans simply change out middlemen?
Absolutely, and this is a bit counterintuitive on the face of it, but to look at these activities in the context of Chinese-North Korean business partnerships, and that being the target, if you focus it along those lines, there are a number of ways in which the Chinese authorities are concerned about North Korean illegal activities. That, I think, would unleash the potential for cooperation on using Chinese domestic policy tools. But it's that angle of framing these as threats and concerns from the Chinese authorities' perspective, and then looking at the common ground that we can work towards this type of cooperation.
Mr. Newcomb, the Associated Press reported this month that Chinese trade with North Korea increased 15% in the first 5 months of 2017 compared to last year. This includes an 18% rise in oil exports to the north, while iron ore purchases from the DPRK were up 34%. What pressure points can we place on China to target this trade?
Clearly, well, we've tried to put the pressure points on China. The renegotiation of the ban on coal exports was reasonably successful, although photography and ship tracking information shows that North Korea ships containing coal continue occasionally to call at Chinese ports. China has not done anything to dent the trade in iron ore because they're classifying it all as for, in effect, humanitarian purposes. So the only way you can really go after the China-North Korean business link is by changing the risk profile. And you change the risk profile by making sure that companies that are engaged in illicit trade have consequences.
You talk about the lesser developed countries and the North Koreans' ability to evade sanctions, and you argued that certain countries that help North Korea evade sanctions should face consequences. Is it reasonable for the United States to oppose multilateral assistance to developing countries that knowingly evade UN sanctions?
I think the answer to that depends on whether or not we can deconflict our national security priorities. In the case of some countries, it might be pretty easy to apply a fairly broad-based sanction. But what will you do in the case of Egypt, where the Ministry of Defense there imported North Korean missile parts? So it adds a complication. Perhaps it's a matter of going in and targeting certain aspects of that country's operation or making it face consequences in other ways. This is where robust action by the Department of State could perhaps stop these in advance. The U.S. capabilities of knowing some of these things before they take place is pretty good.
Mr. Ruggiero, final question. What counts as success when it comes to sanctions and countering North Korea? And kind of a follow-up question, if you could. Some observers have criticized the Trump administration's tough rhetoric and threat of military action in response to North Korea's and the Kim regime's belligerence. Does dovish American foreign policy, in contrast, embolden North Korea, or is this strong language, is that a deterrent?
Well, in terms of the strong language, I mean, the Trump administration is the first one really in the last 10 years to go after a Chinese bank. I think that, to the question of, how do we convince China to go after. China is not going to do this. They're not going to go after these companies. They're not going to go after these individuals. And the reason why these Chinese companies and individuals are engaged in these activities because they know there's no punishment. In terms of success, when you have a regime that's not interested in negotiating its nuclear program, then success will look like protecting ourselves, trying to reduce the capabilities of the nuclear and missile programs as best as we can, and really squeezing the revenue. That's unfortunately where we are 10 years, or excuse me, 11 years after the first nuclear test.
My time has expired, and the chair recognizes the distinguished ranking member, Congresswoman Moore, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I agree with you. We're both on the same page here. We really do want to figure this out, but just listening to the witnesses here, it sounds like this is really like getting the camel through the eye of a needle here. On one hand, Mr. Ruggiero, you have shared with us that you think that there's a lot more sanctions capacity out there, but then again, Ms. Rosenberg, maybe Dr. Park, and maybe you too, Mr. Ruggiero, all of you have said China just is not gonna we're not gonna pressure them into greater sanctions, but we ought to sanction other people that do business with, maybe not with North Korea, but with China. Just want a little clarification about where these pressure points other than China could be, and an example of what those could be.
If I may take a stab at your question. China is a critical player in putting financial pressure on North Korea. And while I believe it's true that China, of its own accord and in the current set of political circumstances, is not motivated to put financial pressure on North Korea, it may see it and will not do it until it sees it in its interest to do so. I think it's possible for the United States to create the conditions such that China sees it in its interest to do so. And as I suggested in my testimony, I think there's a combination of both coordination and pressure on Chinese facilitators and front companies that can and should be applied when it comes to the U.S. bilateral relationship with China to motivate Chinese pressure on North Korea and create those conditions. So certainly that could be and should be a first, primary, most significant press in U.S. work with sanctions, law enforcement activities, and broader proliferation finance policy frameworks. But there are other targets and other, as we've just discussed, vulnerabilities in the global financial system. I've heard mentioned here Malaysia, Singapore. These are clear examples. There are a number of others. Vulnerable nodes in the global financial system where the United States can focus its attention on North Korean evasion.
Thank you, Member Moore. If I could take another angle to this, in terms of pressure points, there are opportunities to cooperate with the Chinese authorities. I know that this may sound unconventional in the sense that there is a primary focus right now to pressure the Chinese government and the Chinese authorities, but just to give a little bit of background. In 2013, I should say, the Chinese authorities, a group of Chinese ministries came together and issued something called Technical Bulletin 59. This was a 236-page report that listed the items and the descriptions, the title of it essentially being Chinese nationals are banned from selling these activities, these items to North Korean clients, and that this would deemed to be a criminal activity. This is broadly a Chinese effort to sanitize its trade with North Korea, but we know that that hasn't worked. After 2013, North Korea has done more effective tests in both ballistic and nuclear fields. What we're finding in the market activity is that these type of efforts are creating more efficient markets unintentionally, in the sense that it becomes easier for Chinese middlemen to approach a North Korean client, get the 236-page report and say, what do you need? And basically list the terms and the higher commission fees and so forth. So the area of cooperation with this node and this segment of the Chinese authority apparatus and law enforcement, I think is another area that we can further explore. That could be a combination of pressure points in other areas like secondary sanctions, but under the heading of capabilities enhancement and going after these business partnerships, this could prove to be effective.
Just to wonder, Mr. Ruggiero, any of you, do you have any thoughts on whether or not sort of shoring up the State Department and getting those assets in there would be a helpful strategy for us?
Oh, I wonder if I could answer the China question, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, go on.
Yes. I hate to be the pessimist here, but we've been trying the work with China for 10 years now, and it hasn't worked. I think we have to be very clear for those of us who were in government delivering a lot of these messages to the Chinese. They were very specific messages for them to act, and so I think we have to be clear about that. I think the example in the Iran sanctions is also important here, where the U.S. fined European banks over $12 billion from 2012 to 2015. So we were willing to fine our own allies, but we're not willing to go after China. I think that's the problem with our sanctions here.
Got you. Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Williams from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, and thank all of you for the witness today. We appreciate it. Obviously, given the recent actions by the North Korean government, this is a topic that, of course, is very timely, and although the most recent missile test did not have the capability to carry a nuclear device, the potential is there, and we must not take these actions lightly. So, Mr. Ruggiero, if I might address you, in an analysis from earlier this year, the nonprofit group C4ADS reported that from 2013 to 16, there were only 5,233 companies in China that imported goods from or exported goods to North Korea. By comparison, over 67,000 Chinese companies exported to South Korea. So I have two questions. First, should we target all banks that deal with this limited set of companies, given that the line between North Korea's legal and illegal procurement is so unclear?
Yes, I think there's a way to target Chinese banks. I think the examples that I provided in my written testimony about some areas where banks are either complicit or they're not asking the right questions of whether North Koreans are involved.
Okay. And second, how confident could we be that a designated firm wouldn't simply pop up under a new name or be replaced by a Chinese competitor?
Well, I mean, this is not easy. It was not easy with regard to Iran. I remember working the aspect of Arisal, which was Iran's shipping line, and we had one person working full-time on that because of the number of times that those vessels changed flags, changed owners, changed everything about them. So this is not an easy process, but in terms of the question that the ranking member asked about resources, I mean, I would, the question I would ask is how many people are actually dedicated to North Korea in OFAC and Treasury and at the State Department? And I know, at least in my time there, that there was never enough people dedicated to this. And that's the real question of how many people are working these designation packages to get us to that point. And it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take some time, but it's still worth it.
Okay. Mr. Park, in a July 13th Washington Post article, a high-level North Korean defector who routinely evaded sanctions noted how, even when North Korean firms are blacklisted, quote, North Korea is 100% state enterprise, so these companies just change their names the day after they've been sanctioned. That way, the company continues, but with a different name than the one on the sanctions list. So with that objection, I would ask that this article be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Okay. In addition, North Korea reportedly confiscates 30 to 90% of what its nationals earn abroad, which may not derive from illicit activity at all. My question is this: no one wants to harm ordinary North Koreans, but how meaningful is the distinction between legal and illegal activity when all of it helps secure foreign exchange from the Kim regime, and when it is so difficult to determine if a company is simply a sanctioned entity that has been rebranded?
Thank you very much, Congressman. One thing I'd like to start off with is moving away from the characterization of North Korea as a country when we look at these business activities. It's really the story of the 99% and the 1%. When we're talking about North Korea Incorporated, that's the 1%. So to your question about looking at some of these activities that Mr. Reed, the former senior manager in Office 39, a very elite state trading company for the North Korean regime, as he's talking about his evasion techniques, you're looking at the operation of this 1% of North Korea Incorporated. When it comes to looking at how to disrupt their activities, I think it's the focus on their partners. The local middlemen are crucial as enablers. So while we do continue to go after the North Korean entities, and as they mask themselves and take on other forms, another parallel effort, I think, is to target these Chinese entities in using a different number of measures, but the domestic policy measures that I mentioned on the Chinese side could be effective if they're labeled in terms of threats to Chinese interests. So the three that I briefly mentioned, the corruption drive, these local businessmen are tied to local corrupt party officials, so targeting them could be one area of further disruption. The second is looking at their narcotics. There is a narcotics problem in the China-North Korea border region that could be another means to unleashing more law enforcement on that effort. And then the third is related to the counterfeiting activities. Something not well known in the West, but certainly a strong concern among the Chinese, is increasing evidence of the North Koreans counterfeiting Chinese currency. So these are areas that I think you can create common ground in targeting these Chinese middlemen.
Congressman, may I answer your question as well?
Yes, ma'am. Sure.
Regarding the difference between what is illicit trade for the North Korean regime and its proliferation aims and what is legal trade, which may then subsequently be used for illicit proliferation aims, it's precisely because of the difficulty of distinguishing these often commingled revenue streams that certain recent UN Security Council resolutions, as well as U.S. sanctions, have gone after entire sections, sectoral sanctions for the North Korean economy, under the assumption that this threat is so grave that even if it is difficult to distinguish these two different kinds of revenue streams, we must put financial pressure on the regime by going after both.
Thank you. Yield my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Okay. First, I support virtually every piece of legislation to tighten the screws on North Korea, and I commend the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee for shepherding so many of those last year and this year, and I hope the U.S. Senate passes them. That being said, we have to determine whether we're willing to just put enough pressure on North Korea to win a small victory. Perhaps one or two people released from prison. Perhaps they'd stop counterfeiting U.S. currency and devote their efforts to counterfeiting Chinese currency instead, versus the big thing, which is ICBMs that could hit my congressional district. I'd ask the panelists not for a prescription, but for a prediction. Do any of you predict that North Korea would not have at least one ICBM able to hit Los Angeles with a nuclear weapon 10 years from now? Is there anyone, please raise your hands if you believe that you would predict that North Korea would not have that capacity? I see no hands going up. Sounds like civil defense for Los Angeles. The issue before us is company sanctions versus country sanctions. As Mr. Park points out, if we just have the objective, as he says, to sanitize China's trade with North Korea, not cut it off, then we would aim at particular companies. But some companies aren't doing business with the United States. Other companies can be created that would focus just on making profits, perhaps a few extra percentage points at the expense of the North Korean government, in doing business with North Korea. Some will rebrand, hide behind other entities. Some will shift to other companies. And sometimes the Chinese government will just wink and let it happen because the Chinese government is determined that they don't want to pressure this regime too much. The other approach is country sanctions, 10, 15% tariff on everything coming into the United States from China. That would get Beijing's attention. Is there anybody on the panel who, and I realize that describing the effectiveness of sanctions this way, you've got to come up with some metric, but I'll take the metric 10% decline of GDP. Let's say we had sanctions, just company sanctions, this and that, to continue passing all the bills that are before Congress, that cut North Korea's GDP by 10%. Do any of you think that Kim Jong-un would give up his nuclear program in order to get that 10% of his GDP back? Any hands? Let the record show, no hands. Do any of you believe that sanctions against individual companies caught doing business with North Korea could cut the North Korean GDP by 10%? I'm looking for hands. I see none. This is depressing, unless you're in the business of building fallout shelters in Los Angeles. is there, so we can talk about country sanctions. I'll ask our first witness. Would North Korea, if they faced an all-out effort from China and the risk of losing all trade with China, be willing to accept a highly monitored small cache of nuclear weapons and a halt to its missile program?
Well, I mean, I don't think that's our goal, right? I mean, our goal is to get rid of their nuclear weapons
did I mention I represent Los Angeles? Yes. I know what our goal is. We're the country that refused to sign a non-aggression pact with North Korea in the late 90s, or was it in the early part of this century? Because our goal, if you want to be a good politician, you just slam the table and say, we want a democratic North Korea and we'll settle for nothing less. And then 20 years from now, when we have a nuclear North Korea, and I'll point out that has been the president's proposal, where he announces that everything goes wonderful in his meeting with the Chinese president, and then we see the massive increases in trade between North Korea and China just during his presidency. So assume that the goal was more modest than our stated goal. Could we achieve it? If we got China to threaten an end to trade?
There's no evidence, based on the 4 times we've achieved this, that a freeze, or which I think is what you're describing, a similar freeze will be effective. I think it's important to remember that during the freeze, the North Koreans developed their covert enrichment program, and they built a nuclear reactor in Syria. So North Korea does not abide by their freeze.
We know they're going to cheat. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for holding this hearing. One of the most interesting conversations I think we've had is with the former director of propaganda, or minister of propaganda in North Korea, who laid out for us that, frankly, this was the #1 priority of the regime, and that the regime did not spend its hard currency on food. That is the responsibility of people, and so many live in the no-go areas that aren't exactly supportive of the regime, that they don't put their resources there. They put their resources into, first, the ICBM program and nuclear program. Second, into paying the military to keep them loyal. And third, their party-building activities around their core leadership. So given that reality, what he indicated is that the one effective thing is figuring out how to shut down their access to hard currency, since it takes them several $billion to run this nuclear ICBM program. It's very expensive. And second, it costs them an enormous amount of money to pay the generals and the military. What we know about Banco Delta Asia was that when given a choice between economic collapse, or bankruptcy, I guess, versus giving up and freezing the accounts with North Korea, the financial institutions decided to do just that. They froze the accounts, and the consequence of that, as we know in hindsight, was that it shut down the production of the line, because we did talk to the defectors, including those that worked on the missile production program. So there is that methodology, which would freeze the banks which are used, and I would say that the line of argument that my colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, walked us through speaks directly to the challenge we have here. Because if their #1 goal is to develop, let's say, 100 ICBMs that can hit the United States, then we have to figure out how to shut down their capability, given the temperament of their leadership, their capability to do that. We know what worked in the past. The other aspect of this that I think is important is we spent a lot of work on human trafficking. Well, here we have a situation where North Koreans are sent to countries such as, and I'll just go down the list, Angola, Burma, Cambodia, China, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kuwait, Malaysia, Qatar, Russia, and Senegal. When we're talking about sanctions, this is why I think it's important we follow up with our second sanctions bill over in the Senate, because we can make it unthinkable to these governments to continue a process of exploitation where people are fed, as one of the managers said overseas, and they work for nothing. We feed them. They work long hours. They get very little sleep, and they don't have any labor problems. I guess not. I guess not. I would say it's time for all of us with one voice to speak on both of these issues and to look at every means available to pressure Beijing, because 90% of that subsidy comes from Beijing. And we know one other thing from the South Koreans. We know that the motors and the wiring was made in China. We also know 10 years ago, when we shut down the production line, that the defectors said the advanced gyroscopes were bought on the black market from Japan. So they do not have the indigenous capability for all aspects of this. They put their money into, obviously, you know, the centrifuge programs, enriched uranium, plutonium, and ICBM. But the parts, if we cut off the hard currency, we could shut that down, and more importantly, we shut down his ability to pay his generals. I think at that point you get the kind of negotiation that Mr. Sherman's talking about, where a regime begins to think differently about just how committed it is to this particular aspect of the program. Just ask if there's any concurrence on what I've argued here. I would just ask the members of the panel if your thoughts on that.
I think that, Chairman Royce, you've highlighted two very important things to do. I worked on BDA, and it was very powerful because it sent a message to the international banking community. And North Korea was not a profit center for them, so they began to shun North Korean business. I think the Section 311 action against Bank of Dandong should serve a similar purpose for Chinese banks. I'm not saying we have to go and do a Section 311 on a number of other banks. Mr. Ruggiero mentioned fines. Fines can play a big role. Bank of China Singapore was complicit in the financing of the Chongchong, which was caught by Panama. Those payments went through correspondent accounts in New York City banks, yet Bank of China Singapore didn't suffer any consequences for this complicity in arranging the finance. So there are things that we can do there. Second, network disruption is key. Network disruption stops the financing and
sorry, the gentleman's time has expired, and we'll let you elaborate later on. Just have to be fair to everybody here. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized.
I'm okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member as well. Mr. Royce, would you desire?
It's all right, Al.
You're good?
Thank you, Congressman.
Okay, I want to thank you and Mr. Sherman for your commentary today. It's been quite enlightening, to be very candid with you. And you and I had a conversation coming over to the hearing about the slave labor, and I'm just going to follow up on that. It really concerns me that we have the slave labor situation that is fueling the nuclear arsenal. And while I can't end every problem in the world, I'm always concerned about freedom, liberty. And my concern has a lot to do with the countries that allow these workers to enter such that they will be exploited. Tell me how we can work to end the exploitation of the workers who benefit very little from their work and find themselves in situations from which they can't extricate themselves, and they need us to help them. What can we do? Yes, sir.
Well, I think that the conservative estimate is that North Korea gets about $500 million a year from this practice. And the UN Security Council noted that that money is being used for its weapons programs, but there was no prohibition on that. I think that what has been used by administration so far is targeting the North Korean individuals and companies that are exporting these laborers. The issue here is what Chairman Royce's bill does, which is goes after the companies, the foreign companies and individuals that employ this labor, and that is the next level. But I would also caution here in the sense that this gets us back to the China problem and Russia problem, where certain estimates suggest that 10,000 in China, at least 10,000 in China, and 20,000 in Russia. So while we should be able to roll up the rest of the 50,000 or more, 20,000 total outside China and Russia, we're going to be back to the, are you going to sanction Chinese and Russian companies and individuals for slave labor? That's where we're going to head toward.
Does it always come back to China and Russia, regardless as to where we start? Do we end up with China and Russia as obstacles?
I mean, I would say yes. I think there's the China issue where you have the volume of trade, and so there's value. There's always value in going after Southeast Asia and Africa countries and countries in Africa, and there's countries in Europe where there's a North Korea problem, in the Middle East. But we're talking about millions there, whereas with China we're talking about billions. So I think, and then the issue with Russia is that there's some indication that they might be backfilling some of the aspects that China is increasing its own sanctions. And I'm thinking here of oil and aviation fuel and jet fuel. The Treasury Department in early June sanctioned a Russian oil and gas company for its relationship with North Korea.
Assuming that we had the will to act on Russia and China, what level of retaliation should we expect?
Well, I would say it depends on how we do it. I mean, one of the things that I've advocated
Assume
for—
that we take what you consider the most efficacious action.
Well, the examples I can give you, they're not numerous because we haven't gone after Chinese companies and banks. 2013, we went after North Korea's foreign trade bank. Bank of China closed that account inside China. Last year, the C4EDS's report forced the hand of acting against Dandong Hongxiao, and the Chinese government finally froze assets and arrested people. Bank of Dandong, frankly, they haven't really, I mean, they've talked a lot about it, but they're not going to stand up and defend the fact that one of their banks was a money launderer for North Korea. So again, if it's done the right way, we're not talking about impacting U.S.-China broad trade relationship.
Would someone else? Yes, ma'am.
Just to add further to this, there's an effect that will come when the U.S. takes specific action to engage in sanctions or use the Patriot Act 311 authorities, and there will be an amplification of this effect when global banks, specifically those based in the United States or in Europe, in highly regulated jurisdictions, highly concerned about proliferation finance and with the capacity to do broad big data analysis for this, when they see that certain entities in China, for example, are sanctioned in this way, it gives them more information and better tools to go after this and improve the way they search for proliferation finance transactions and, in turn, what they require of their correspondent banks in China and elsewhere in vulnerable jurisdictions, who then also increase the searching for and freezing of North Korean illicit finance when it moves through their jurisdictions.
And Mr. Chairman, may I just say that I'd like to thank Mr. Royce for that piece of legislation, and the ranking member as well, and you. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for your expert witness today. I think we have established once again the reality that we cannot work with North Korea in good faith. We certainly learned that through the Clinton years and through the Bush years. We at one point had sanctions there on the Bank of Macau, which were very effective and operated in good faith then. I'm glad to see that FinCEN will be greater employed, as I sense, to impose further sanctions. As well, it seems to me that these companies that supply material support to North Korea, I'd like to get your understanding of how many companies that there are right now. I mean, China has been very aggressive in acquisitions in the U.S. today and buying technology. They spent $50,000 in acquisitions, $50 billion, excuse me, last year alone, and much of that targeted toward acquiring technology firms. We passed a bill last week that I had introduced that would punish those technology firms that provided material assistance to North Korea, and not allowing them to do contract work with DOD. But I would like to get some sense from you of what's the scope of companies there. We fined ZTE a few months ago $1 billion, something I'd spent a lot of time on, for selling technology not only to Iran, but also selling embargoed technologies to North Korea. These are the kind of, I think, meaningful efforts we can make. But give me your response and what else we can be doing in terms of impacting these telecom companies, and how many there are. What's the scope of our mission there?
Let me start. Thank you, Congressman. I don't think anyone has a good fix on the universe, the total population of companies that are involved. Research by C4ADS, as was mentioned earlier this afternoon, shows that there are over 5,000 companies involved in trade with China. And that actually is a bit of an overestimate of the concentration, because the time devoted to this work wasn't sufficient to enumerate some of the subsidiaries of these companies, so it's probably inflated a little bit. What was even more impressive about this work, though, is the concentration of managers, directors that are guiding this network. North Korea's illicit activities operate in licit space. They leave tracks, financial tracks, purchasing tracks. You can get at them through business-to-business databases. It is researchable. Some breakthrough reports have been done over the last couple of years demonstrating this. Investigative reporters have broken stories on Glocom, and most recently on a company in Singapore named OCN that operates a complex trading relationship with North Korea. So you can go after them. And I agree, if you just designate entities, then you're playing whack-a-mole. You have to also designate the people that are operating them and get them on the compliance lists.
One thing that we are seeking right now is to address CFIUS, and it hasn't been reformed since the Gerald Ford years when it was established. And we are working on legislation right now because we believe that we need much greater review, and with the enormous amount of recurring investments that are taking place by the Chinese in acquiring these technology firms, including those in our supply chain of DOD. But the Chinese appear to be very much focused on their technology advancement, and the best way they get is to steal it or buy it. But it seems to me that should be a clear direction that we need to be about, and make sure we have the best tools available to prevent those types of acquisitions. Would you concur with that?
Yes, sir, I do.
Any other comments by any of the rest of you? Thank you. I yield back.
I recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here. Thank you for taking a keen interest in this topic on this subcommittee. And I think we all saw today why we appreciate so much Ed Royce and Congressman Ingalls' engagement in our Foreign Affairs Committee, and what a fine job they do together on behalf of the American people. You know, there's been a lot of conversation. My friend from North Carolina mentioned it. You know, we're on our fourth president now in dealing with North Korea, since we've all acknowledged the clear and present danger of North Korea's nuclear program to the west, to the region. And so 24 years have gone by. We've had a lot of sort of Neville Chamberlain moments along the way, and we haven't seemingly accomplished our goals, the goals of the United Nations and the United States and our partners in Asia. So I really want to explore that a minute and say, and maybe if each of you could respond, is, in your personal view, in your professional capacity, is China today, in working with the Trump administration, the most active and helpful they've been over that 24 years? And you're making a relative statement. In other words, are they engaging and realizing that this has gone on too long and been too inconclusive and is not in their national interest to let it proceed? So are they more engaged than they have been over 24 years? I'll just go down the row if you'd start, Mr. Ruggiero.
No, I don't think they have done enough to rein in North Korea. I think they're interested in the freeze, which is not an option really here.
Mr. Newcomb?
There has been an increase in cooperation from China over the life of the sanctions, but it's not enough.
Yeah, okay. Ms. Rosenberg?
I would agree with that, and maybe I would put the peak last year, unfortunately going in the wrong direction.
Right. Dr. Park?
I think it's a very complicated picture. There are different interest groups in China, particularly at the provincial level, that have very close economic benefits with these North Korean border provinces. So with that, I think there is this conflict within the Chinese hierarchy. Quick thing I would mention, out of the 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, 2 come from the provinces near the border with North Korea. Their elevation and their path to the Politburo was from cranking out economic growth in their jurisdictions. So it gives you a sense of how the enmeshment and entanglement, it makes it a very complicated picture within China. There are some agencies and some ministries who are keen on trying to sanitize this trade, others that are working against it in order to work with corrupt party officials and make a lot of money.
Thank you, and that's helpful. And so then when I look at ourselves, the United States and the leader of sanctions, both at the United Nations and then bilaterally with our allies, over that 24-year period, are we now just getting it on how we should really design and impose sanctions and enforce them? Because you guys are really talking in the present tense and talking about the nuance about how to really do the administrative work, how to really do the enforcement. And as a representative of the taxpayer, I'd say, what have we been doing the last 24 years? Just sort of experimenting unsuccessfully, and now you think we've got it right? So give me a little feedback about design. Are we now prepared at the United Nations and here in the United States with our allies in the region to do a more aggressive and better job at designing and implementing sanctions? And I'm trying to be constructive. I mean, have we learned from our mistakes? I'll phrase it that way. And suddenly we can do a more effective job, or we just have the willingness to do a more effective job now because we've allowed 24 years of progression. Again, let's go down the row and hear that, Mr. Ruggiero.
Well, I think the fact that sanctions have doubled in a little over a year indicates...
Still modest on your chart, though, compared to...
Sure, yeah, exactly, compared to other sanctions programs, but the fact that it has doubled suggests that we were not even really focused on North Korea. And now we're focused on whether we should act against China, and that's the outstanding question. And other administrations have determined that it's not a priority for the U.S.-China relationship. That's the outstanding question.
Thank you. Mr. Newcomb?
I think the United States did too little for too long, and they're just now thinking about getting serious about it. But again, it depends on establishing this as a national security vital interest.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Rosenberg?
I think that there's been technical capacity in the administration to do very good creative targeting work for decades, and there has been select dedicated leadership in Congress also on this issue. However, there's 2 things that have changed more recently that I think have really brought this to the fore. One is the experience of what many believe as success in the Iran sanctions case, where the United States led a global coalition of countries that engaged in financial pressure applied to Iran, and it worked in affecting Iran's economy and their political calculus. And the second issue that has changed this picture, and I think the political will around it, is the perception of a much more imminent threat, as was discussed by Congressman Sherman and many others who feel this way, to the United States and U.S. vital interests.
Thank you. My time's expired. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
So Dr. Park mentioned it in his testimony, the coal trade between North Korea and China. And when the word coal comes up, it piques my attention because I represent the great state of West Virginia. That's been a major driver of our economy for years, our #1 product. Despite the previous administration's war on coal, we still believe in coal, and we believe it's going to come back. So anyway, when coal's mentioned, I pay special attention. But my question really for anybody on the panel who wants to address it, because in 2016, China negotiated the loophole, which you referenced, Dr. Park, in its coal trade with North Korea, which permitted the purchases of the coal for, quote, livelihood purchases, close quote. Livelihood purposes. And so what would be anyone on the panel's assessment of the humanitarian exemptions in North Korea sanctions? And a follow-up to that, are the sanctions too difficult to enforce, and how meaningful are they giving Pyongyang's control of resource distribution to its people? Go ahead.
If I could take a first crack at your questions there, Congressman. One of the things about the loophole that you mentioned, the livelihood purposes, there's actually a larger loophole. In 2009, October, then Premier Wen Jiabao led a Chinese equivalent of a cabinet delegation to Pyongyang, and they signed a number of trade deals, and they created essentially the openings that became the coal trade between China and North Korea. That was the enabler. And the message from that trip to Chinese companies was that under Chinese law, it's legal to do business with North Koreans, and that created something of the opening of the floodgate. But the loophole that they had there was under the headings of economic development, tourism, and education. Those became the gateways that the Chinese justified a lot of their trade with the North Korean entities. But to your point about the humanitarian exemptions, there are, I think, important elements that we have to be very careful of. But if we go back to these loopholes and how the Chinese have been using those as the legal justification to do the coal trade, right now with the sectoral bans, I think there's an incentivization of smuggling along the border as well. And that's what we have to factor in as we try to look at other measures to implement sectoral bans and other things. We should not be surprised by these activities, but when you restrict quantity, prices go up, and you incentivize smugglers, in many instances, the very officials who are tasked with implementing the sectoral bans.
If I may add to John's answer, the livelihood provision on coal was changed in the following resolution 2321, and because China was not employing it correctly, they were misapplying the measure and granting anyone the opportunity to import coal and just going through the motions of saying it was for livelihood purposes. So 2321 imposed a quota system, and it was a hard-won concession on the part of the Chinese. And it appears to work episodically, but not totally. Now, the livelihood provision remained in force on iron ore, which continues to soar as a part of trade.
Thank you. If there's no other comments, I'll go ahead and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panel. I really appreciate your input. It's been very helpful. Prior to coming to Congress, I spent about 15, 16 years in manufacturing. And obviously, China exports a fair bit of manufactured goods to the United States. I also serve on the Terrorism and Illicit Finance Committee, and we spent a lot of time there talking about know your customer. Is there a burden to know your supplier? So when you go to China, you do business, most American companies wouldn't say, hey, I'm doing business with a North Korean. Because to them, they're not. But the Chinese company may very well have a beneficial ownership interest that's North Korean, or maybe one of the companies in China that has chosen to do lots of business with North Korea. Is there any burden to know your supplier in that extent?
I think the answer is it depends, and it depends a lot on your banking regulator. So taking a step back. So for most global banks who handle the financing side of manufacturing trade, there's obviously an importance placed on, or a requirement to know your customer. And many of the major global banks, those in the United States and Europe, also feel the need to know your customer's customer, which is another way of getting at knowing your supplier. And there are some leading global banks, for example, Standard Chartered, which takes this very seriously. They also have a business footprint, if you will, that is in a lot of very high-risk jurisdictions for terrorism and proliferation financing. They send teams of their bankers out to educate their correspondent banks so that they do not find themselves in the position of having a correspondent banking relationship with, for example, a bank in China, where the trade that they're financing, the supplier may actually be supplying North Korean goods, that kind of thing. So one of the ways that they're trying to know the supplier or possibly the beneficial owner is by taking that training out to their correspondent banks. There's other versions of this, but I think some of the biggest global banks take it very seriously, and too many banks, regional banks elsewhere in the world, are completely unaware, which is a major vulnerability.
Thank you. To follow up on that, if you're an American corporation, could be manufacturing, could be agriculture, could be shipping, whatever energy, you're going to wire some money to a Chinese corporation. And as Chairman Royce pointed out, they really need hard currency to pull this off, or they need core components. They get this through means like this. That wire transfer goes to a Chinese company, but may very well benefit North Korea. Follow that back to the know your supplier. What are the burdens by the U.S. entity, not just the financial institution, in making that transfer?
I'll go ahead.
Mr. Newcomb? Or Mr.
Well, in terms of suppliers, too few, I think, actually try to manage their supply chain. There's an Australian sportswear company that accidentally found that a North Korean textile manufacturer was sewing made in China labels on its clothes and then shipping it through China. This was discovered through investigative reporting, not through their own due diligence. So it's a very difficult process. But the problem is North Korea operates banks within banks, using foreign subsidiaries, fronts, shell corporations that act as a bank that absorb the money from various North Korean-linked sources and then pass it on. That's where banks are failing to know their customer. And that's where banks are failing in due diligence, and that's what is exactly exposing our financial system to money laundering and terrorism and proliferation risk.
Thank you. Dr. Park, question for that. Let's say that there was a law similar to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or Know Your Customer Act that said you're fine to do business with the companies in China, including state-owned companies in China. However, you can't do business with any company that does business with North Korea. You must know your supplier. Would that have a deterrent effect or a decrease in hard currency going into North Korea?
It could possibly, but in many cases, the way that it's masked, even the middleman is surprised that they're getting semi-sourced products, well, the middleman directly, but the supply chain is such that I think it's so complicated to get these things aligned unless you get these rules and regulations in place. One thing to explore, though, I think, is the use of incentives. If there could be ways to monetize this information that can lead to the interdiction or some notion of tracking down to the source, that's something we haven't explored. I think that's a very robust area, the area of incentives.
Thanks. I'd love to talk longer, but my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and without objection, we will move to a brief round of second round of questions. To recognize myself for an additional 5 minutes, Mr. Newcomb, I want to ask you about sanctions enforcement a little bit more. You've highlighted implementation challenges with existing sanctions, and according to the UN panel of experts' final report, following the adoption of UN Security Council sanctions last year, 43 of 54 countries in Africa failed to submit their national implementation reports. The UN report also highlights difficulties in countries' ability to coordinate their sanctions enforcement and in basic failures to freeze the assets of entities acting on behalf of designated persons. So aside from using secondary sanctions to encourage foreign countries' compliance, what is the role of technical assistance, be it through the Treasury Department, IMF, or other international financial institutions, in improving those countries' ability to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions?
That is ongoing. The panel of experts actually works with the Financial Action Task Force and with the FSRBs, in particular the East Africa Anti-Money Laundering Organization. So the education on what is required by the resolutions is taking place. The bottleneck appears to be in the political process of adopting the rules and regulations necessary to implement and enforce. And of course, overcoming the political will. North Korea gave material assistance to a number of African liberation movements. It supplied arms, and so it built a lot of goodwill. The problem is convincing a number of African countries that their future relies in the international area in cooperating to suppress the North Korean program and not facilitating its support.
Mr. Ruggiero, I think earlier you defined the objective well. If the objective is not just deterrence through mutually assured destruction, if the goal here of sanctions is to force North Korea to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile programs, if our goal is to stop North Korea from being able to threaten the United States with a nuclear device, if that is the objective, please define success, each of you down the row in my remaining time. What does success look like with an updated sanctions regime?
Well, I think success in terms of protecting ourselves is less successful missile tests. I think less the ability for North Korea to deploy these missiles, the inability for North Korea to make advances in its weapons programs. Those are high goals, and those should be the high goals. If our goal currently is not denuclearization, because this regime is not interested in that, we should have a high goal in trying to protect ourselves against North Korea's nuclear and missile programs.
And in terms of, and specifically in terms of success of what the sanctions should look like?
In terms of success and what the sanctions, I think that there's been a lot of questions about the scale, and I think Bill did a great job of sort of describing these are really networks. If we start to take down complete networks, you know, the Dandong Hongxiao action last year was incomplete. It didn't sanction any of the front companies, and through the Bank of Dandong action, we learned that Dandong Hongxiao was doing 56 million in transactions through that bank minimum. So we need to be completely going after networks. We need to be using fines or other criteria to go after Chinese banks if we're really going to be serious about this.
Mr. Newcomb, Ms. Rosenberg, and Dr. Park on the same question.
I agree with everything that Mr. Ruggiero said, and I would add that success also means we've got to be working much more closely with other like-minded countries. They have got to be doing the same thing. The EU has imposed sanctions on entities that do not appear on the SDN list. I mentioned the Pyongyang company that did the radios. That's still not on the SDN list. We've got to step up the pace.
Ms. Rosenberg and Dr. Park?
I would agree that success in sanctions implementation looks like taking down these networks that prop up the North Korean proliferation aims and motivate massive enforcement by other countries at the national level around the world, specifically in China. Furthermore, that this success for sanctions will only act to empower and strengthen and coalesce U.S. alliance relationships in Northeast Asia and never come at the expense of them.
Dr. Park.
So very quickly, I think it's disrupting North Korea Incorporated's business partnerships. This, in terms of the nuclear weapons and the ballistic missiles development, those are happening because of their procurement capabilities of business practices. So we have to break up these business partnerships, and targeting using these different policy tools that I mentioned earlier, I think prime candidates for slowing it down so that North Korea doesn't build out this arsenal of ICBMs with nuclear weapons.
Thank you for your conclusions. And now I recognize the ranking member for an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all and for this very important discussion. I'm wondering, Ms. Rosenberg, you indicated in your written testimony that it was sort of a lost opportunity to build the sort of international coalition and consensus on sanctioning North Korea at the recent G20 meeting. Is that what kind of message does that send? How can we recover from that diplomatically? And you know, what should we do in the absence of having not done that? I guess I'll let you respond to that.
Thank you for the question. I think it's an incredibly important question. I see that as a massive opportunity missed, and it sends the wrong signal only days after. This is still in the news cycle for anxiety and concern about the ICBM test, that the United States didn't provide leadership in that forum, particularly when, as has been stated by other representatives at that meeting, everyone shared that concern, at least in some fashion. The way to come back from that or to address that, not just that as I see it failing, but this issue more broadly, is for the United States to take the opportunity in meetings, at highest level meetings in relation between the United States and China, bilateral meetings, as well as in every appropriate multilateral forum, to raise this issue again and again and again. And I think the severity of it demands nothing less.
Just a thought on the diplomatic efforts. I think, Mr. Garrell, you mentioned that we do need to deploy our diplomatic assets. And I'm just wondering about the recent nomination of Mr. Huntsman to be our main diplomatic asset to Russia. Do you think that his history and his background, it would be a lot more useful to have him switch back to being an asset and a diplomat to China?
Well, putting aside whether, leaving it to the Senate to confirm him, his prior postings in Singapore and China, I think, provide ample background on the North Korea issue because, as Mr. Newcomb said about Singapore, that's a significant North Korea hub. We've already talked about China, and as I mentioned in answer to a prior question, there is this sort of suggestion that some of this activity is moving from China, some of this China-North Korea trade to Russia, and I think that the administration is concerned about that. So I expect, if he's confirmed, that a large portion of his interactions with the Russian government will be about North Korea.
Okay, so it might be beneficial for him to be in that spot. Okay. Ms. Rosenberg, you talked about expanding the Patriot Act. Could you just share with us a little bit on how you want to expand the use of the Patriot Act?
Thank you. I think I'll highlight two things. So the Patriot Act 311 authorities that have been used with noted success by a number of members of this committee before to target Chinese proliferation concerns, North Korean proliferation concerns. There's an opportunity to both increase the use of the specific tool. It's a really useful one, including by comparison to sanctions, but not that one should exclude the other, because when a 311 is made, there's an awful lot of information that becomes available to companies, manufacturers, banks that are in the position of trying to look for and prevent North Korean trade and illicit finance from occurring. So it's a very useful kind of action for the information it gives. That's one way. Another way is that in that same piece, I would just say the opportunity for greater information sharing between the government and banks and among banks that can be facilitated by statute, not the Patriot Act in particular, but in order to facilitate more such 311 actions. So that's a Banking Secrecy Act opportunity to expand and create some safeguards around greater information sharing. That's another thing that can further the opportunity.
We need a statutory expansion.
I think that's a great thing to consider by this committee.
All right, thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and the chair recognizes Mr. Williams for an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Newcomb, in a 2015 report, the UN estimated that North Korea had sent 50,000 laborers to dozens of countries who provided them with $1.2 billion to $2.3 billion annually. And in an article from July 11th, the New York Times noted how North Korean laborers in Russia saw their wages confiscated by the North Koreans in amounts that hinged on the ruble's exchange rate with the dollar. How do we prevent North Korea from exchanging laborers' foreign earnings into desirable currencies, be it dollars or euros, whatever? And how do we prevent the DPRK from subsequently accessing those currencies, whether it is in the form of bank accounts or in the form of bulk cash?
Sir, the relationship supplying workers to Russia, mostly for the logging industry, has existed for a number of years. And more recently, of course, there's the supply of a lot of North Korean workers to China. I really don't think that there's a lot that can be done directly to curtail these numbers or impinge upon their ability to earn money through that. But you can go after all the other countries on the list that Chairman Royce read. There were other countries on that list earlier. Poland has now stopped its use of North Korean workers. Malta has stopped its use of North Korean workers. Malaysia has said it's going to reduce the number and send them back. Some of the North Korean workers are building facilities for the World Cup. Why in the world, as a member of that, is the U.S. going along with it and not raising serious objections to that? I think every place the North Koreans are, particularly in countries in the Middle East, where we have a lot of influence, such as Qatar, why are the workers still there? Why are they still in Kuwait, right? I don't think we're exercising the diplomatic and other kinds of pressure that we can bring quietly in these jurisdictions to get them to abandon this practice. Otherwise, North Korean workers need to be treated, if they're going to be hired, under International Labor Organization standards, and they're not. Now, the companies that provide them are receiving the money, the workers are not. They're getting a pittance. And in many cases, the money is being carried back to North Korea via cash couriers. Now, that can be intercepted as North Korean cash couriers go through international checkpoints. So we have opportunities to put a dent in this.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Dr. Park, what behavioral change could trigger the relaxation of financial sanctions against the DPRK? Is it a complete freeze, would you say, on missile development?
The North Korean regime is a subject of a number of sanctions. So even if there were the ones that linked to North Korea stopping the activities on ballistic missile development, there are other sanctions in place that I think you would see the North Koreans coming back expecting sanctions relief. But frankly, at this particular point in time, the North Korean regime has not expressed any interest in terms of the notion of trying to coordinate some sort of deal for the relief on these type of sanctions.
Okay. Justin Hastings, Dr. Park of the University of Sydney, has written that Taiwan was only second to China as a focus for North Korean trading partnerships after 2006. What's your assessment of Taiwanese efforts to prosecute brokers of illicit North Korean activity, and can we do more to remove Taiwan from the DPRK's trading network?
I think there are a number of measures in terms of looking at these type of business partners, but in addition to Taiwan, there are also Japanese-based entities, largely tied to the North Korean resident community there as well. So I think Taiwan and the Taiwanese companies, in terms of their activities, documenting them, sharing that kind of information with Taiwanese authorities as well. But a number of these type of activities, especially under the private sector, growth of compliance within different financial institutions as well, as another means to do this. But we have more tools, and I think with that, there is an opportunity to apply the accumulated learning on our side in terms of these North Korean practices.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time back. Thank you.
Finally, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio for an additional 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. Thanks for sticking around for a few more questions. And I thank my colleague for the question about Taiwan and our other countries. Some of these countries we have great relationships with, we consider allies, but they're not exactly supportive of our efforts with respect to North Korea, perhaps others, but the topic here is North Korea. You know, we've talked a little bit about sanctions. We've talked about how going back to the 90s, we haven't really been as serious. We've had forays into economic policy, messaging maybe. When does the line cross and it's really economic warfare, where we're going to use every economic means possible to stop this? If we're declaring North Korea as a potential existential threat, that's obviously something that could be a trip line for kinetic force, not just economic. So So what escalations could be possible? Dr. Park, you mentioned one that we haven't, incentives, but I guess down the line, if you could, what are we not doing with respect to diplomacy with our allies like Taiwan and Japan, but with respect to anything that's in the kit bag or potentially in it?
Well, I think you're right. We're not serious when it comes to either diplomatic or economic input with our allies in particular, and that's why in my testimony I referenced the Iran-style sanctions, which is, and I know it sounds bravado, but that's essentially what we did with Iran. It was either North Korea or us. And I think that that's the like-minded coalition that the administration could build.
True warfare.
But it gets back to, it will still circle us back to China and Russia, so we're sort of avoiding the larger question, unfortunately.
Mr. Newcomb?
I think much more can be done with Taiwan. There are Taiwanese companies that do cooperate with North Korea. Royal Team comes to mind. There are others, including one that was prosecuted in Chicago about a year and a half ago. Taiwan is a trading nation, right? Mm-hmm. And so they look for opportunities to sell. Taiwanese machine tools get copied by the North Koreans one way or another. When Japan started to prohibit trade with North Korea, a lot of the activity was redirected toward Taiwan. So Taiwan needs to do a lot of its own due diligence about what its own companies are up to. And in terms of moving to economic warfare, you could probably draw the line at a blockade. Crossing over into a blockade would definitely move us into economic warfare.
Thank you. Ms. Rosenberg?
I'll just add to this. So what's the trip line for waging economic warfare? I think what we ought to be careful to encourage sanctions policymakers to remember is that when we get there, whatever that looks like, and it may be a bit of a moving target, the blockade is certainly one I would endorse, but there will be other kinds of threats to our allies and ourselves. That economic warfare should always come as in my view, a counterpoint, in addition to, alongside the credible threat of military force. And so there should be no situation where economic warfare is ever waged by itself. It has to come at that point, at that severe point of threat to U.S. interests. It must come along with the use of military force posture and potentially projection.
Thank you. Dr. Park, if you have another one.
I would just echo what my colleagues were here saying, but also one of my colleagues at the Kennedy School, Aaron Arnold, has also been looking at the notion of what are the implications if you double down and concentrate more along the lines that would potentially trigger something like economic warfare. There is also the negative unintended consequence that different trading countries migrate away things that are U.S. dollar-based. So we have to anticipate that. It's not to say we shouldn't pursue some of these course of measures, and certainly, as my colleagues have here been saying, in the context of a broader strategy. But I think we have to look at these very complex unintended consequences because we are going to trigger both positive as well as these negative unintended consequences.
Thanks. I have one last question. Lots of folks in this whole deal would like to see the United States off the Korean Peninsula. We've been there since 1950. I think that wouldn't be a bad outcome. What would it take for us to see that as a win in our departure from Korea?
Well, I think the problem in this current circumstances is that if the United States withdrew from the peninsula, that could increase the option of North Korea becoming more aggressive, and I think that could also lead to South Korea and perhaps even Japan considering developing their own nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I think short of that, it would take some sort of reconciliation path between North and South Korea that similar to what happened in East Germany and West Germany, personally. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I spoke too soon. The chairman of the Capital Markets Subcommittee has arrived and would like to ask 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I had the privilege of chairing this subcommittee last time, and my interest is definitely there. I would like to put for the record, not sure where my colleague was going, not everybody agrees that we ought to be withdrawing from the Korean Peninsula, well, someday, yes, there's a lot of aspirational things happening here in Washington right now. So, I do believe we have a strategic interest there, both with South Korea and Japan. Dr. Park, in your testimony, you had suggested using China's anti-corruption campaign to target corrupt officials who facilitate North Korean trade, and also note that Chinese have an interest, or at least should have an interest, in stopping North Korea's trafficking of narcotics and counterfeit bills in China. I would think that would be of strategic interest for them and practical interest. I mean, what kind of room is there for truly meaningful cooperation in these areas? Is that really in the cards for us? And how can the U.S. impress on Beijing that a harder line with Pyongyang it will serve its own self-interest?
This is a very nuanced approach. I mean, on the face of it, the idea of cooperating with Chinese authorities seemed to be something that would not work. But there are two outstanding recent trends. One is the growing urgency among the Chinese leadership about how quickly North Korea is developing its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capabilities. And the second, I think, is the possibility of coercive U.S. economic measures directed on a larger scale. We've had the precedent secondary sanctions against the Bank of Tandong and potentially others as well. But in this atmosphere, the notion of using these means, the question then becomes, where can you get political buy-in and where are you going to get the sustained coordination? I would offer the Commerce Department's newly launched Comprehensive Economic Dialogue, and as well as the State Department and Pentagon's approach with their Chinese counterparts within the diplomatic and security dialogue as venues where they can explore further cooperation in these areas. Because if you do look at it from the Chinese perspective, there are now concentric circles. They may not look like much in the beginning, but certainly those can be expanded and done in a way that we're looking at it from Chinese interests and expanding upon those towards creating this notion of slowing down the procurement on the North Korean side. And I would conclude that the overall image that one can imagine as a basis of this type of discussion is a sanitization of China's trade with North Korea. It's actually a small sliver of the overall quote-unquote legal trade that is illicit. And if you look at these commercial channels, they become almost like dual-use technologies. If you're moving innocent goods through, you have all the intermediaries and process in place to move illicit goods through. Breaking that apart and using these different types of domestic policy tools on the Chinese side, I think is a serious area of investigation, given the urgency.
And it's my understanding that and I'm not going to get the phrase correct, but the industrial park that was in North Korea, that it was fenced going in from South Korea and had North Korean workers there and trucks coming out. Absolutely. My understanding is that's been shut down, correct?
Absolutely. The Kaesong Industrial Complex, yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and what has that had any kind of effect in North Korea? Has that been a pressure point?
I think a lot of researchers have documented how the revenue earned from essentially rent from those facilities went to the North Korean military. But since that's been shut down, that source of funds to the North Korean military has also ceased. There is some discussion among this new government in South Korea, the Moon Jae-in administration, to explore potentially looking at ways to reopen the Kaesong Industrial Complex, the broader part of their North Korean policy.
And you think that would be a positive move?
I think if you look at it from their rationale that they try to use that as an incentive, enticement to the North Korean regime, they have to factor in the fact that the North Korea-China trade far overshadows what's happening in the potential restarting of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Okay. It really is, I think, critical that we look at how the Chinese authorities, in particular the Communist Party of China, has been rebuilding the Workers' Party of Korea and North Korea for a stabilizing game plan for a number of years now. And that's something that has a certain type of momentum.
In my last 30 seconds, which I need 3 minutes really to do this, but Mr. Ruggiero and Newcomb and Dr. Park as well, you know, the Banco Delta Asia had been tagged as a primary money laundering concern. You brought up some of the bank sanctions. I mean, are there any lessons that that case can carry forward, and are there any specific high-profile designations or prosecutions that should be pursued in order to make Chinese banks a little more reticent in helping out?
I mean, I guess I would say the lesson learned, I know people see that as a silver bullet, that doesn't exist right now. I think that going after something similar to that, where North Korea values it, whether from a financial or commercial perspective, I think some of the information coming out now clearly indicates that the Justice Department and the Treasury Department are going after Chinese banks allowing US dollar transactions, which are illegal on behalf of North Korea. And I think that's the right approach. But again, it's going to take a lot of work on the part of the Trump administration to reverse the tide over the last 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today for their insightful testimony, and you all have certainly informed our oversight of U.S. sanctions policy as it pertains to North Korea and our oversight of Treasury's implementation of those sanctions. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is adjourned.